Great, thank you. I just want to say that Michael Pazanni is a distinguished scientist at the data science that I'm sorry, I don't quite know how to pronounce that. Hillig, it's a Romanian name. How do you say that, Michael?
I've never learned it perfectly myself, so we can, since he's not here, anyway, it's fine.
Okay. Anyway, that particular data science institute at UC San Diego, Dr. Pazanni received a PhD at UCLA and has worn many hats across the UC system, from a full professor at UC Irvine to, of course, as he is, a distinguished scientist at UC San Diego. He was a vice chancellor of research at UC Riverside, vice president for research at Rutgers, and a director of the Information and Intelligence Systems Division at NSF. And he's, of course, currently a member of the Defense Science Board. So with all that, he also has time to make great research. So I would like you to please start, Michael, and let's hear about this.
Sounds great. So I'm going to talk about my research in explainable machine learning. And this is going to cover about 25 years of work, 2 different NSF grants separated by about 25 years, and a DARPA grant as well mixed in. Okay, so the first question is, why do I use the term explainable machine learning instead of explainable AI, which is the more common term? And one of the reasons is because I find explainable AI is too broad. When you go to a explainable AI workshop, you hear about tutoring systems, game playing, planning, lots of things worth explaining, but the technologies and techniques are a bit different. So I'm focusing on how you explain things that you've learned from data. I've been in machine learning for the past couple decades, and I'm going to talk about 2 different projects. One is interpretable machine learning, which is really from last century, things like decision trees, rules, regression. And at that point, many people were looking at how you make the decision tree or rules as small as possible so they're more interpretable. I always found the real question, though, is how do you make them in such a way that an expert agrees with them? And so we'll focus a little bit on that, and I'll give some examples of predicting salaries, and then a collaboration with some MDs at Irvine on diagnosing mild or early dementia. And then we're going to jump ahead to this century where we have opaque learners like deep learning, and it's difficult to follow the learning process. Most of the research in XAI is basically exposing that learning process, creating ways to interpret or visualize what the opaque learner is doing. But I think the real question still is, does an expert agree with the learned decision process? Are we creating knowledge that people find useful? Are we explaining it in a way that they find useful? And then I'll give examples from bird identification and then collaborations with someone in radiology at UCSD, looking at COVID-19 and other diseases from X-rays and CTs. And the current direction, I'm going to propose a Turing test for explanations. Essentially, can we make AI systems whose explanations are indistinguishable from those of human experts? And we'll see that the current generation is a bit far from that, and I think it's a worthwhile goal to pursue. So going back a while, field of knowledge discovery and databases was created, and it had a very nice mission statement, if you like. Knowledge discovery from databases is the process of identifying valid, novel, useful, and understandable patterns in data. In spite of that, if you read the KDD journal or go to the conference, 98% of the papers are invalid, and very little is on novel, useful, and understandable. I'm going to focus a bit on understandable, and I'm actually going to start with a simple example that came up when I was chair of computer science at Irvine. This was a study being done to figure out if the university, computer science, physics, etc., were being fair to female faculty. And the way that it worked is you'd create a model of the salary of male faculty, And then ask how well does that model predict female faculty salary? If the average error is 0 and it's uniformly distributed, then female faculty are being treated fairly. If the error is skewed towards negative, then female faculty are being underpaid. Happy to say when I was chair, the female faculty were treated well and the model showed that, but in some other departments it found some problems. So the way the university did this is they modeled the salary as a function of the year of birth, the year of hired, and the year of degree, easy things to collect, as well as the salary, treated that as the dependent variable, and then came up with a model, which I'll show on the next slide. So the average faculty member is paid $3 million a year minus $293 times the year of birth, and minus $808 the year of degree, minus $593 times the year higher. And the problem is this model found that there were some departments doing discrimination, but when you talk to the department, they'd say, well, the model makes no sense whatsoever. So is there ways we can transform the model to have it make a little bit more sense to show that there actually is a real problem? So one simple thing to do is use just a linear transformation of some variables. Instead of year of birth, use year since birth, which of course we call age, years since degree, and years since hired. And if you do that, you actually get something that makes a little bit more sense. Faculty are paid $48,000 plus 293 times their age, etc. And if you really wanted to, well, there aren't many faculty who are 10 years old, so you can create a new variable called years above 30, assuming your average faculty member starts about year 30, and you get this equation, which actually is a good, at that time, was about the starting salary for a faculty member in computer science, $64,000. And again, plus $293 times the years above 30, and $808 times the years since the degree, etc. So that seemed to make a little bit more sense. However, that made sense for computer science. When we looked at social science, something else popped out, which is there seemed to be a penalty for the years over 30 and years since hired. So you had negative coefficients on those variables. Although each of them is positively correlated with salary, when you use regression, you actually got negative coefficients for those variables for very good and understandable reasons that physicists, that statistics understand, but still it doesn't quite make sense. So I wanted to see if we can address this problem by having equations that are more intuitive. And to do so, we looked at a different domain, or still with salaries, of baseball player salaries. So can you predict the baseball player salaries from their statistics, like their batting average, their on-base percentage, the number of singles, etc.? And these are a number of baseball players and their salaries. Only one I recognize at this point is Sammy Sosa, but that's a whole different issue. If you run regression on that, you come up with an equation that looks like this. The salary of baseball players is minus 180,000, 0.9 times their on-base percentage. But then some things start not to make sense, like minus 0.8 times their batting average, or minus 18 times the number of doubles. So why would a player go from first to second base if each time they do that, they lose $18,000? So, again, this equation fits the data well, but you can argue it doesn't make sense. So can you come up with a better equation, fits the data almost as well, but perhaps makes more sense to people? And that was the problem we focused on. So the goal is, within a representation language, whether it's decision trees or regression models, rarely is there a single model that outperforms all others. So perhaps we can select among a family of statistically indistinguishable methods by some other criteria, and then ask the question to people, well, how willing would you be to use this model? So for linear regression, we introduced a constraint called the global bias, also called the monotonicity constraint, which basically said that people are more willing to accept a model where the effect of each variable in combination with the others is the same as the effect alone. So if more home runs means more salary, that should have a positive sign. If more strikeouts means a lower salary, that should have a negative sign. Then we can constrain regression to obey these constraints. So you can look at each variable independently, see how it correlates with what you're trying to predict, and then the sign of the coefficient should be constrained to be the same as the sign of the correlation coefficient. We call this independent sign regression. If you do this on the same data, you get this equation, which, for instance, has a positive coefficient for doubles instead of a negative coefficient, and a positive coefficient for batting average. This model had slightly higher mean squared error on the training data, but predictably, using cross-validation, there was no statistical difference. But I'd claim this is a better model to use because it makes more sense. It's a great claim. So how do you go out and prove that? Well, we just showed equations to subjects from the psychology pool, and we asked them to pretend they were an agent who was negotiating the salary for a baseball player, and then ask, how willing would you be to use this equation just as a rough estimate of the baseball player's salary? Showed them a variety of different equations, some of which were formed with this constraint, some without the constraint. And essentially, on regular multiple linear regression, people had an average rating, an average negative rating, in fact, of the equations because of these constraint violations. But with independent sign regression, they actually had a positive mean rating, so they were happier with those equations. As an aside, people always ask the question, well, why didn't you use variable selection instead? And in essence, if you use forward or backward variable selection, if you get rid of half the variables, you get rid of half the problem, but you don't get rid of the whole problem, where independent sign regression gets rid of the whole problem. So that shows a simple example with independent sign regression. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about a collaboration I had with Rod Schenkel, the doctor at UC Irvine, in which we analyzed data on mild or normal patients, telling severe Alzheimer's from normal is easy, but trying to predict mildly impaired is quite important because there are actually interventions you can do to slow down the progression of dementia. So the data had various cognitive questionnaires, demographic data, your age, your gender, simple cognitive tests. Can you repeat this address? You may remember during the election, President Trump bragging that he got all 5 right on this and he thought Biden wouldn't do as well. Can you say the months of the year backwards? And then even lifestyle questions. Do you shop for yourself? And in general, a general practitioner, so you don't often see a specialist, was about 60% accurate at telling normal aging from mildly impaired. Neurologists are about 85% accurate. And when we threw a number of machine learning algorithms at it, we were able to get things about the same, or in some cases, slightly better than neurologists from the same data. The problem, however, is the same problem we saw earlier. The models didn't necessarily make sense to the neurologists, so they were reluctant to use them. So here's an example of a decision tree learned by C4.5. And basically, it starts with how many mistakes did you make repeating the address? If you made no mistakes, you're normal. If you made more than 0 mistakes, then we ask how old you are. If you're greater than 52, we ask what your education level is. If it's less than 16 years, we ask the question, do you shop for yourself? And if you shop for yourself, you're impaired. And if you don't shop for yourself, you're normal. And that tended not to make sense because in the whole data set, shop for yourself was a test that was indicative of mild dementia. But again, once you start subdividing the data, it was being used as in the opposite direction. And we really wanted to avoid these tests in the opposite directions. And not just to pick on decision trees, but rule learning system I was involved with called Focal, on the same data, learned rules that were very accurate, but didn't make a lot of sense, starting with if you have more than 5 years of education, you don't know the date, you don't know the name of a nearby street, then you're normal. Now, every time I gave this talk at a university, it was the case that I didn't know the nearby street and didn't know the date, but you know, so the things underlined are being used in the opposite direction they should be used in. So can we correct this problem? And the solution is similar to the solution for the regression. Again, it's a global bias for each variable. You find the correlation between that variable and the dependent variable. In the regression case, we had a certain constraint, but in rules, you ignored tests that violate this bias. So essentially, if a test is usually evidence for something, it shouldn't be used as evidence against, and vice versa. We also came up with techniques that could introduce this in a soft way, but save that for another time. So when we did this, we came up with rules that were equally accurate, but in this case made much more sense to the neurologists, and we'll see in a second they were more willing to use. So there were none of these constraint violations in the rules. So what we did is, to test this out, is we generated different rule sets with and without this bias, basically showing them different subsets of the data, so they generated slightly different rules. On average, there were a little bit more than 2 violations of this constraint without the bias, and of course, none with the bias. It didn't have a significant difference on accuracy, didn't have a difference on length. At that point, people were always saying, well, maybe smaller is better, so you better measure length as well. So we did that to please the reviewers, but found in essence that the neurologists were more willing to use with the constraints than without, in strong statistical significance. All right, so that sort of wraps up last century. And basically a variety of predictive models exceed or rival the performance of people, but predictive accuracy itself wasn't sufficient for adopting the model. And people had various assumptions about what made things easier to understand. There was great things with visualization tools, simpler is better, rules are better, but really these weren't tested that thoroughly. My own philosophy was, within a representation language, as opposed to comparing different ones, there are techniques you can use to make it more or less acceptable. And so select among those models by these acceptability criteria. And the one that popped up most often was this global bias. So now zooming ahead to more recent work, of course, there's been a lot of progress in machine learning, not just on tabular data, but fantastic progress on image analysis. So can you identify cancerous molds from this? And of course, there's an app for that. But the problem with that app is it doesn't really explain its decision. So a question I have for the audience is, would you trust a robot to identify cancerous molds and remove them? Right now, there are robot surgeons, and I think hopefully most people would like a little bit more evidence, even greater than predictive accuracy, on these techniques. Of course, many people have recognized this problem, and about 4 years ago, DARPA came up with a project called Explainable AI, in which they proposed, or challenged people to solve this problem. Again, the problem is we just don't want to say it's a cat with 0.93. We want to say why it's a cat, and you understand why, to build more trust in it. DARPA, the slide showed cat. We're also interested in identifying aircraft and troop positions from satellite images, etc. But if a black box just pops out, that's an enemy. Is that sufficient to fire upon it, for instance? Or do you want to explain why it's an enemy? I think this was, one of the best conceived DARPA programs. I really liked the way the call for proposal was written. I even had an opportunity to read the pitch to DARPA that Dave Gunning produced to create this, and it was very, very solid. Really liked it. This has motivated me to start working on image classification with deep learning. And I now have some collaborators at UCSD in radiology We got an NSF grant recently to look at diagnosing COVID pneumonia, distinguishing it from other types of pneumonia from X-rays or CTs. And essentially, if you've seen deep learning, there's this nice convolutional neural net. You throw another network on the end that does classification. This is often transfer learning by learning on a large variety of natural images. But the problem is, can you explain it in a way that radiologists understand? And interestingly and or amusingly, the exact same network and architecture works equally well on radiology and bird identification or a variety of other things which we are also working on and using this to guide some of our research in explainable deep learning. And before I go into the research, I'm actually going to ask you to participate in some image recognition. I'm going to ask you to see 10 images of birds. 5 of them are Clark's grebes. 5 of them are Western's grebes. They look pretty similar. And well, see if you can tell them apart. And then we'll actually ask you to type into chat how you tell them apart. So this is a Clark's grebe. They're actually found in near Marina del Rey in the Bologna Creek area, things like that. But the Western grebe is also found there. So that's a Western grebe. That's a Clark's grebe. That's a Western grebe. That's a Clark's grebe. Western. Clark's. By the way, Lewis and Clark discovered the Clark's grebe. That's a Western grebe. Clark's, Western. And now, is this a Clark's or a Western? And type that in. So if it's a Clark's, do thumbs up or yes. And if it's a Western, do thumbs down or no. Now I will say, I often show these 3 times when I'm in a class. I've only done it once here. Okay, so Daniel Benjamin got this, was the first one to type in that it was right. The black behind the eyes is a sign of a Western grebe. The Clark's grebe has white behind the eyes. And then, Craig Knobloch got the color of the beak is also different. One is yellowish, the other's a bit more orange. So we'll go back and look at a couple of these. So you can really see who's paying attention. So again, that's the Western, the darkness is below the eye. It's got a orangish beak. And the Clark has a white around the eye and the beak is a bit more orange. Well, after we've done that, we'll get into how systems are doing this explanation. But I arrived at UCSD about 18 months ago, maybe 20 now, and hooked up with a radiologist who actually had a system that was already deployed at UCSD to do image analysis of X-rays, chest X-rays. And in particular, one of the things he looked at was a problem that is of great importance today, which is, have you inserted the entracheal tube properly? If you insert it too deep, it's too far in and doesn't put air into the lungs. If you insert it too shallow, it also doesn't put air into the lungs. You have to get it just where the lungs split, if you like. And he had a nice technique for doing this. When COVID came out, I actually blind emailed an author of a paper in Wuhan who was nice enough to send us 60 examples of people with COVID before it had hit the US, and we started working on that. But again, now let's talk about explainability a little bit. When there's 2 basic approaches to explaining neural nets. The bottom-up approach is you manipulate images. and then see their impact on the classification. So if you obscure an important part of the image, say like the eye of the grebe, then it would have a lot of errors in predicting whether it's a grebe or not. On the other hand, if you obscure the wing, we'll say that wasn't so significant, that's not that important. The other way to do it is top down, where you analyze the output of the neural network, the activations and the weights, and propagate them all the way back to the images. And we're looking at both of those methods. And I think the next slide shows some done by students at UCSD and some done just from the literature. So again, they're finding the COVID and finding an area where it is. I will say, I object to a lot of this, including the title of this paper, a machine-centric strategy for explanation, where quite frankly, I think it should be a human-centric strategy. Things like LIME, a very popular system that manipulates the inputs, are finding things. My favorite one is layer-wise relevance propagation. It works really well on birds, but doesn't work so well on COVID, which is interesting. And we'll discuss that in a minute. And some other ones, including some of the founders of deep learning, light up areas, etc. Layer-wise relevance propagation, again, you look at the output, you go down each of the layers, and it does a reasonable job of finding where the bird is in an image and compares it to some others. Now in medicine, there's another technique that people are commonly using called UNets, not commonly used outside of medicine to my knowledge. And essentially UNets are trained a bit differently than the, convolution neural networks. You give it both an image and a segmentation mask, and then from new images, you ask it to produce the segmentation mask. And the way that it works is this part is a standard convolution neural network, but then it upsamples to recreate the segmentation mask. But now I'm going to do some critique of all of the work in Explainable AI. And in essence, a lot of the work is focused on mathematics, which is important. And there's actually some interesting things that show some of the techniques are extremely sensitive to small differences in the weights. And these small differences might just arise from having a different seed of your random number generator as you train the neural network. Other techniques are a little bit more stable, including LRP, which is why I like that. But nonetheless, for the most part, it's all math and the intuitions of computer scientists. And if it's evaluated at all, it has very little ecological validity. We're asking Amazon Turkers or computer scientists to do things. And if you look at the setup, for the most part, it's teaching subjects about heat maps. I think all that's important, but I've been focusing recently in collaboration with some people in cognitive science. I actually see one of the graduate students, Robert Kaufman's, joined the talk on ethnography. And this is using the techniques from anthropology, if you like, to study explanations in their natural context, to study bird watchers or radiologists. And we analyze those artifacts and conversations. I've been involved in some of the pilot studies, which we'll show in a minute. There's been a number of survey papers. I'm not the only person who thinks social scientists have something to contribute to this. And some of the survey papers point out that many explanations draw contrasts between similar or easily confusable items. Why is this a Western grebe and not a Clark's grebe? And if you look at really how transfer learning and other things enter into this, in some ways, the neural network is also answering the question, why is this a Western grebe and not a stop sign? That's a harder, it's not as important a question to answer. And all the contributions from things that are not very similar to grebes enter into the explanation. And again, if you focus on contrasting explanations, I think you get closer to, differential diagnosis and what some experts are doing. Another thing is that explanations are often at multiple levels of the hierarchy. So sometimes you ask, why is this a grebe, as opposed to why is this a western or a Clark's grebe? So you're asking to contrast it with a duck versus a grebe. And then a lot of the literature focuses on trying to debug the mental model of the user. So unfortunately, from my perspective, from a social scientist or ethnography or cognitive science, there's been very little study of visual explanations like what radiologists do or what bird watchers do. And then the mental model is important, but unfortunately, deep learning really doesn't have a mental model of the user. The user's not in it at all. There has been some interesting techniques trying to do that, but for the most part, not really in your average learning model. So first, we've worked on contrasting visual explanations. And here the techniques are, you find the most likely class, and then you find a contrasting class. In a neural network, it might be the second most likely class, but the user can select it, can ask the question, why is this, as opposed to that. You find the pixels or features most indicative of the most likely class, and you subtract out the features most indicative of the contrasting class. So in bird watching, if all you do is explain why this is a cerulean warbler, it pops up things here. But if you ask the question, why is it a cerulean versus a black-throated warbler, it concentrates well on the eye because there's a difference there, on the neck, actually a little bit on the foot, which is interesting because this is an unusual bird with blue feet as opposed to brown feet. And it is focusing a bit on the stomach as well. Another student of mine at UC Riverside looked at the digit recognition problem, MNIST, and came up with a system called contrastive deep explanations. And in essence, it would answer the question, why is this a 4 and not a 9? By saying, if you want this to be a 9, you'd have to have a little bit more things filled in here and maybe have this corner a little bit more round, not so square. If you look at many of the other techniques, well, you can kind of see the 4 in there, but for the most part, they're not answering the question, why is this a 4 and not a 9? If you just look at some of the artifacts of bird watchers, they say things like, well, look, there's a black cap below the eye or above the eye, and the yellow versus the orange bill that people pointed out earlier. And in fact, one of the things we started to do is interview bird watchers and radiologists. Before I get to that, we also did some eye tracking studies. So these were set up of, you use an eye tracker, you show an experienced bird watcher, and you ask them a question. Is this an eastern towhee? And they concentrate on the features that distinguish an eastern towhee from this case, it's a spotted towhee. And one of the big differences, the spotted towhee has spots on the wings, the eastern towhee does not. For the grebe that we saw earlier, you can see they're concentrating in on the eye area, maybe a little bit on the bill as well.
So this one I'm going with a western grebe. The dark kind of totally encompasses the eye here.
By the way, Zoom has made interviewing experts much easier. You get a full recording of it. You get them to circle things. So if there's any silver lining of these very dark cloud, it's made some of this research a little bit easier. I actually want to go to this next one because this is a little bit longer, and he actually does a contrast with 3 different birds that are similar. And by the way, this guy, David Rankin, used to make a living counting birds for wildlife and other things. So he's quite good.
To be a Bell's vireo, you can tell it's a vireo by the kind of a little bit stronger and thicker legs than a lot of than like a warbler. Even though it has the bill is hard to see the shape, but it looks kind of like a thin but slightly thicker bill than a warbler. And then I get to Bell's vireo by doesn't have the bold spectacles here, just kind of some faint spectacles and kind of a broken eye ring, kind of weak wing bars, kind of longish tail, and just kind of overall plain gray whitish with maybe a little bit of greenish tones, but not very bright. The looks.
I'm going to move on to a radiologist now.
Large lymph node, whereas the normal contour of the aorta probably is this as it comes down. So I see that, but there is also overlapping with it some of the branch pulmonary arteries that are doing this. And there's multiple lobulations, so there may be multiple nodules. Here's another one doing this, all this stuff here. These are nodules, but there's this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy and this guy. There's like, the more you look, the more you see. There's like hundreds of nodules everywhere.
Okay,
So,
and what are these nodules indicative of?
Probably metastatic cancer. They're really dense and they're many and varying in size.
Okay, let me actually come up with an interesting observation, because in the past 6 months, I've been reading the radiology journal more than the AI journals. And there's every radiology journal article about deep learning shows heat maps like we saw earlier. But then there's radiology articles where radiologists are explaining to other radiologists what's going on in this image. Especially with COVID, there's new discoveries coming up all the time. And well, they're not using heat maps, they're using arrows or circles, but more importantly, they're not just saying this is an area of interest, they're saying what's interested about it. There's dilated vessels or fibrotic glands or ground glass density or consolidative opacities. And so what I really think our AI systems have to do is not just find regions of interest, but explain what it is about that regions of interest that makes it of interest. And if you read the journal articles again, there are these tables that say in late stage COVID, there's more, actually, I think it's the crazy paving pattern is very common in late stage COVID, but not early stage COVID. And well, there's many lung opacities, more than 2 lung opacities in late stage COVID, but not in early stage COVID. So I'd like our AI systems to come up with explanations like our radiologists. So instead of teaching radiologists about heat maps, I want to teach AI about meeting the challenges of radiology or, well, bird identification. If you look at a bird identification guide, they do point out regions, but then they describe things like this bird, this owl has powerful feet, and this has lightly built feet. So that's where I think we should be heading. And well, if I think we should be heading there, that's indeed where we're heading. So one of the approaches, we're actually exploring a number of approaches, I'll just go over one of them here, is an area called multitask learning, where you have an image of a bird and you classify it just like the convolutional neural network does. As an aside, in addition to classifying it down to the specific bird species, we also classify down to the species. So we can ask why this is a yellow warbler or why this is a warbler at all. But then the neural network can also answer things like, is this a short bill, an average bill, or a long bill? Does it have a ring around the eye, just the upper eye, a complete ring, etc.? Now it's worth pointing out that these descriptions like eye ring are not inputs to the system, they're outputs to the system. So in the same time you're learning whether this is a palm warbler or a yellow warbler, you're also learning whether it has a complete eye ring or a partial eye ring. And then you can point out in the images whether these are, this is in this case, it's a vireo, and it has a complete eye ring. So we started to do this. Here's an example of some of the results on multitask learning. These are done by an undergraduate student at UCSD. So these are two somewhat similar birds. Obviously, you can tell the difference is that one of them has red wings and one of them has black wings. And indeed, in addition to telling this is a scarlet tanager versus a summer tanager, the network is also producing this has black wings, this has red wings as the explanation of that. Now we're just starting on this. We're actually transferring more of the work now to COVID because, well, that's where the funding is. Don't have results there yet, but hope to soon. But I think through these collaborations, by really studying what experts are doing, we can produce AI systems that meet the needs of experts as opposed to teach experts about AI. So to wrap up, I think in the past few years, there's been a lot of progress on exposing the inner workings of algorithms. And in some ways, these have been very useful for computer scientists to debug the algorithms or perhaps to see deficiencies in data. There's a great example of telling huskies from wolves, but the huskies are always on snow and the wolves are always on snow and the huskies are always on grass. So the explanation algorithm isn't looking at the animal at all, it's looking at the background. That's useful for showing that you ought to have a greater variety of data. However, for the most part, I don't think these systems are meeting the needs of explaining to experts or novices or apprentices what our AI systems are doing. And so I really think we need to propose an explanation Turing test where essentially the explanations should be just like radiologist explanations. So our future work is we're starting to study explainers. We're looking at labeling regions and in essence using a broader set of tools than heat maps. So if all you have is a paintbrush, you paint things, but these other tools, circles, arrows, and most importantly, labels are important. Real simple to put a circle around a heat map, have an arrow point to the center, etc. The harder part is identifying or describing the regions. And we've made some progress on that with multitask learning, also exploring a couple other approaches as we speak. But let me wrap up now and take questions. And first, thank NSF and DARPA for providing the funds over quite a few years. And thank my students and collaborators at UC Irvine, UC Riverside, and UC San Diego. And if you want to chat with me offline, I'm meeting with a number of people later today. There's my email again, so we can set that up. So happy to take questions, either video or chat. Not sure which way we do that, but whatever you normally do.
Thank you, Mike. I would say, let's see if anyone wants to raise their hand. And maybe okay, so Stephen, you can start.
Hi again, Mike. Thanks for the good talk. I have a question. I'm a layperson in this area, but in the example that you showed about faculty salary, a question struck me. You gave the example of starting with the year of birth and then moving toward age and then age past 30. And it occurred to me that all of those different variables are really the same information, and maybe some are more intuitive than the others, and you add to a constant factor and change the multiplier, but it's the same amount of information coming through in the model. Can you distinguish between explainability in terms of transparency of the model versus sort of this idea of intuition that may make, you understand?
That's a good question. So you are right. Those are simple linear transformations. A linear transformation of the data, you can do that, which results in a linear transformation of the model, but it's the exact same model. What I was really using, though, is getting at that to look at the difference in the signs. So for the most part, I didn't think using age versus year of birth was important. You wouldn't have noticed the sign was wrong if we used year of birth because the model isn't intuitive. Once we made the variables make sense, then you notice that the model itself doesn't make sense. So I wasn't focusing so much on the linear transformation, but once you start constraining your regression to have other constraints, it actually is a different model, one that doesn't quite have the same, reducing the mean squared area the same, but one that almost reduces it, but has this other property of having fewer of these constraint violations. And I'd argue, and at least some of the psychology evidence we've collected, is those constraint violations make models less acceptable to experts.
Okay, thanks.
Hey, Mike, so I had a question about your example with the birds was interesting at the end where you said, okay, you could distinguish these two birds based on whether or not it had a black wing or a red wing. And it seems like one of the really interesting problems is coming up with the set of features themselves that you use to distinguish them, right? So one way you could do this is you give the system the features. The other way is you could actually have the system figure out what the features are. So which one were you actually doing there?
Good question. So we were giving the system the name of the features, but not the location or a description of the feature. And it was simultaneously learning long beak versus short beak while learning warbler versus vireo. But you are correct, we came up with those. So when we talk about radiology in particular, let's ignore birds because I think that's a little bit more well understood. We want to leave open the possibility that there's a feature that we don't have a name for yet. Now, many of the features, ground glass, etc., are common in the radiology literature. There's even a radiology ontology. But with COVID, people are finding new things they haven't seen before. There's actually holes in the lung that COVID is causing, and it's never been seen before. So we want to leave open the possibility of saying this has ground glass, but it's got this other feature I don't have a name for. And I've noticed this other feature in a lot of images due to feature similarity. So can you help us come up with a name for that image? So we definitely want to leave the possibility of having the system identify novel features that people haven't seen before. But when there's common features that are well known to radiologists, we'd like to encode them into the system. Difference being, however, in early work on computer vision, there were special feature detectors hand-coded for things like this. And in our case, we want to learn how to tell the difference between ground glass and crazy paving through examples. At the same time, you're learning the difference between COVID pneumonia and bacterial pneumonia.
Great, okay.
So I hope that gets it, but it's a good question and an important one.
Yeah, no, that's great. And thank you for the talk.
Now, I will say some of the techniques that we're looking at require you to paint the image with this area is the black wing, this area is the red wing. Other techniques don't. The one that I showed you, the multitask, does not.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a technique of using multiple U-nets that basically requires you to paint the beak, paint the wing, etc. And I think there's pros and cons of each. I mean, there's also just a hope, for magic, if you like, right? You just presented a billion images, it comes up with something. In fact, there's a great quote from Hinton that says, and this is a 5-year-old quote, in 5 years, we won't need radiologists anymore. I still think you need radiologists to do accurate labeling of your training data. And in fact, we have a debate with the radiologist, and there's this tension in AI, as you now no doubt know, in machine learning. What can you do with a large quantity of poorly curated data versus a small quantity of well-curated data? And there is that tension, and different people fall on different sides of that spectrum.
I have a question for you, Mike. So I wanted to ask you about prior knowledge, how much we can trust prior knowledge when we're learning from data, how to complement and extend that prior knowledge, and pointing out features that are important for this particular task is one thing, but adding to the knowledge that there is on recognizing birds and classifying species and so on is quite a different undertaking. So since you've done so much work on the kind of cognitive aspects of learning and building concepts over what is already known, I just wonder what you think about the future of AI in terms of, rather than learning specific classifiers, help to build this more global knowledge. So, and I ask because you pick these domains that have to do with science, right? And the scientists kind of have this aversion to, having a laser focus on this one little thing when they have so much else that whatever you're learning needs to fit with. So I wonder your general thoughts in these topics. Thank you for a great talk.
Okay, so first of all, I agree with you 100%. Having done work in explanation-based learning and others, which is using explanations to learn quickly, there's something missing in in many of the current approaches. And let me say that if I'm successful, I'll be able to build a learning system that comes up with, after analyzing 1,000 X-rays of COVID, can explain to a radiologist what's wrong and why. However, what's not happening is, can you take an explanation? This person has COVID because they have ground glass in 4 lobes, and have the system take advantage of that as opposed to have to see that in 1,000 examples. So as you might have guessed, I am an amateur bird watcher, not nearly as good as the people that I've interviewed. And in many cases, I've only seen 1 or 2 examples of a bird, from Arizona or someplace I don't normally go to, but I've gotten pretty good at identifying it. And that's something our systems can't right now take the knowledge of. The way to tell a Western from a Clark's grebe is the Western grebe has dark below the eye, the other one doesn't. You tell someone that, they can instantly figure that out. So I do agree with you. It's an important topic to look at. I had a conversation earlier with Peter. We were talking a little bit of knowledge graphs and things. And in essence, I think that's almost a challenge for the next generation. It disturbs me a bit when students think, AI started with Hinton and don't know about Minsky, Schank, Feigenbaum, Newell, Simon, etc. So I think one of the goals is to make sure our undergraduates or graduates working on these detailed problems in deep learning also put it in context and understand the bigger picture. So I don't have a solution to your problem, but I acknowledge it's an important problem. I'm glad you're in part working on it. And I would encourage others to work on it all as well. And for that matter, if it's not already, I'd encourage DARPA to revisit that problem.
I have a question. Mike, thanks for the really nice talk. So in this talk, you focused on using explanation to explain a decision by a machine learning model, say to a human expert, to sort of have confidence in that or not. I'm wondering whether you have applied this in the opposite direction to allow the explanation to help you build better models, to debug your models, to figure out what's wrong in the data or whether your model is doing something wrong with respect to the data and what it's learning, to understand better what's actually going on inside your model to sort of improve the whole machine learning process?
So that's a good question. So first of all, there has been some work, not mine, Dan Weld at University of Washington. You may be familiar with a system called LIME. I mentioned it. He's actually building a system called LIME Aid that can take the explanation, have the expert change the explanation to be correct and propagate that back to the learning system. Invite him to give a talk on it. I think it's a very interesting work. I will say that, I did work 30 years ago on that. There were, on influences and learning new influences, on outcomes and things like that. A combination of explanation-based and similarity-based learning, where the similarity-based adds things to your knowledge base. Maybe worth revisiting. Always hate to see work just disappear, but I'm not. I think it's time to get back to the problem that you and in some ways Yolanda suggested of growing your knowledge base from data as opposed to, well, explaining what you've learned.
Okay. Luis Garcia wants to ask another question. I want to have him ask before noon. Luis?
Yeah, great talk, Michael. I had a question that may be similar to what Yolanda and Hans were talking about. I was wondering if you could comment on what you think about one of the issues we've run into in these explainability models is how to evaluate the efficacy of an explanation. And usually we've done user studies in the past, but what we found is that, unless you say that, one challenge is defining the efficacy relative to a task that you're trying to do, whether it's somebody debugging a model or a doctor having to make a decision, or even trying to explain to another AI. So I was wondering if you could comment on it. Maybe there might be some mental models for the I guess the explanation side of things. I don't know if that was a messy question.
Yeah, not going to directly answer your question. I'll give a couple things around it. So first of all, I mean, again, I agree with you. It's important. I will say I'm not very happy with most of the studies that people do on explainability. It's very leading questions. And again, it looks like they're teaching naive subjects about heat maps. So for me, the question is, can you, replicate what an expert is doing? And again, sometimes that expert would explain things differently to another expert, to an apprentice, an intern, or to a patient. And so to me, replicating what the expert does is the real way you should evaluate this. The question that I've always found most interesting is, asking someone, would you use this system? So there's been a number of DoD systems developed, et cetera. And sometimes they don't get into use because the users don't, the users or the environment doesn't trust them. There has been some technique of, seeing if the expert heat map looks just like the AI generated heat map, and there's, dice coefficients and things, you can evaluate it. But I think that's heading in the wrong direction. And at least for me, I want to bring more ethnography and anthropology into computer science at this point, I think is the direction to really evaluate this.
Thank you.
Great. I think we only have time for one more question, but Christina is up. Do you have a brief question, Christina?
It can be as brief as Mike wants it to be. So I was fascinated by your, you mentioned monotonicity constraint in kind of human explanations, human judgments. And it was really fascinating. I had kind of two-part question. One, is it folk wisdom, or is it based on some sort of principled theory? And second of it, also, wouldn't it be a subject, I'm afraid that it might be subject to things like Simpson's paradox, where you might have, be relying on positive correlation. People might think that there's positive correlation among some variables, but with the outcome, but underneath it might reverse, because due to Simpson's paradox, underlying correlations might indeed be negative.
So first, a good question. Thanks for asking it. Unfortunately, I only have time to answer the easy part of your question, and we can talk about Simpson's paradox perhaps offline, because I'd like to. There is a little bit of evidence for monotonicity constraints. So my NSF grant was actually co-funded with a psychologist at Georgia Tech, Dorit Billman, who's done a lot of work in the basic area of categorization and explanations for categorization. And it's sort of, there's a preference for no negative interactions. And again, if something is evidence in favor of something, you only use it as, you don't use it as evidence against. However, there's also techniques we've looked at to make that a soft constraint versus a hard constraint. So if violating that constraint results in a statistical significant improvement, then you do it. But if there's 3 or 4 different ways of coming up with a model, and one of them doesn't require you to violate that constraint, then you don't violate the constraint, if you like. I do understand Simpson's paradox, etc., but I think that's I think I'd want to sit down and chat with you over a concrete example of that. But thanks for bringing that up. I haven't heard that in many years.
Great, thank you, Mike. And this was an incredibly interesting talk. Given it's noon, I think we'll have to stop now.